Hi General Maths students. In this video we're going to examine time series. We're going to look at time series trends by examining graphs of time series. We need to decide what sort of pattern is involved. The three patterns that we study and that we need to be able to recognize and understand are these ones listed here: seasonal, cyclic and random. So a seasonal pattern, that is data that repeats over a regular and predictable time frame as stated here. So we can see this graph. This is a seasonal pattern. So we have the same shape of the graph repeating over distinct time intervals. So we can see that we have this repeating type of pattern where we have a peak followed by a trough and then the same shaped peak followed by another trough, and the time periods that these occur over are consistent. Cyclic is similar to this. We have the same pattern repeating, but it's over irregular time periods. So we can see this same shape to the peak here and here, but when we get to the third peak, that happens that, well, the gap between the second and third peaks is really quite small in time, whereas the gap between the first and second is longer. So a repeating pattern, but over irregular time periods. Now random is just as it sounds, no real pattern or predictability. Okay, the other thing that we need to be able to determine is whether we have an upwards or downwards trend. So that's simple enough. We can see here that if we sort of line up the peaks of this repeating pattern, this seasonal pattern, it kind of goes in a downwards trend, and same with the troughs, maybe not that last one, but overall we've got this downwards trend and a random but upwards trend on the side here. Right, so I'm going to leave this with you. Or you can pause the video at this stage and see if you can identify the time series trends. So we want to, for instance, if you thought it was a seasonal trend, you would label it seasonal, and then you've got to decide whether it's upwards or downwards. So you need to pick one from this list for each graph. It's either seasonal, cyclic or random, and then I'll go a different color. Is it upwards or downwards? So we need to have one from the pink highlighted list of words, one of those, and one from the yellow for each graph. Okay, you can pause now and try this on your own. Then I'll pick up where we left off. Okay, so I'm going to go through these now and identify the time series trends. So this first graph here in the top left, this one is a seasonal pattern. We can see this repeating pattern over the time. So it's happening, this same peak, this same shaped peak happening over repeated time intervals, consistent time intervals. It's roughly the same time between each peak. Now, as for upwards or downwards, we're probably looking at a slight or a bit of a downwards trend here. I know this first peak, we go up to the second peak, but then we can see we start to go down from there, and the troughs are lining up in a downwards trend. So we'll call this a seasonal downwards, this one. Now this second graph here, this appears to be random. There's no real repeating pattern here. Maybe you could argue that this bit here looks the same as that bit to some extent, but we've got this really sharp bit in the middle there that's not really like either of those. So I'm thinking this is random. They can be open for a little bit of debate sometimes, these ones. And I know that when I'm doing these to a class face-to-face, often students will say, oh, I don't agree with that. But this is a video, so I'm just going to call this random. And it seems to be a bit of an upwards trend here. Okay, this third graph over here, looking seasonal. we've got this sort of interesting double peak, almost like a sine or cosine sort of graph, but a large peak followed by a smaller peak, and then that's repeated again over the same period of time. So we're looking seasonal here. And this looks pretty steady. If you line up the top peaks, or the bigger peak, and then the shallower or smaller peak, I think this is steady. So rather than saying upwards or downwards, we'll just call this seasonal steady, or you could just say it's seasonal neither upwards or downwards, perhaps. Right, moving to the second row of graphs. So this is an interesting one. We're getting this similar sort of shape happening here, but we're getting a larger gap between these two than we do between these two. So I'm thinking this is cyclic, with this repeating pattern over irregular time intervals. Now, is this upwards or downwards in this trend? That's kind of difficult to gauge here. We sort of go like, a lower, we have this trough here followed by a really low trough, but then this trough seems to be higher again. It's difficult to say. We'd like to see a bit more of this to decide whether it's a upwards or downwards trend. So I'm just going to kind of say that this one is steady, although you could argue that it is a bit downwards, but tough one to say. Okay, over here, this is definitely seasonal with this repeating pattern, this sharp sort of peak, and it appears to be going upwards with its trend. And the last one here, now we've kind of got this flat top shape, a couple of pointy ones that look kind of similar to one another. You could argue perhaps that this is cyclic because we do have this pointy sort of pattern, and we can see this irregular time interval. There is some room for debate there. I'm going to call this one random though, because this first peak, it has a flat top, and the other ones, this one sort of has this type shape to it here, whereas this one is just no sort of extra part to it. And it looks pretty steady to me. So that's my call. But as I alluded to earlier, sometimes these can be open to a little bit of debate. I mean, the seasonal, the ones with seasonal trends are often very obvious, but perhaps there can be a little bit of room for debate about cyclic versus random trends. However, it's your turn now to go into the description for the video and check the questions that you can try from the textbook to start to improve your ability to identify these time series trends. So thanks very much for watching.